be talking to y'all tonight. I've been hearing good things in Tennessee about folks in Mississippi. Follow on Facebook the camp, and they say it's one of the largest in Mississippi, and most active, and I can see that tonight by the good crowd here. So do appreciate everybody coming out. We're looking forward to talking to you a little bit. This is my wife, Casey. She's going to run the little slides for us tonight. We'll talk about the Battle of Trenton. Not so much the battle itself, but more about what was happening in the town of Trenton at the time, which was about 1,500 people lived there before the war. That began to decrease a lot. We're going to talk about that and some of the stories that were told. A couple of things here I want to show you tonight, some of the photographs. Most of this information comes from a couple of newspaper articles that was written about 1902 and about 1904 by a man by the name of Charlie Buck Harwood, the Harwood family of Trenton, Tennessee, very prominent. Several of them were attorneys. This gentleman went up to Nashville in the 1870s. He was grown about that time and lived there, and really not sure what he did. It slipped my mind what his profession was, but his name is Charlie Buck Harwood, and I didn't have him on the slide tonight, but this is a photograph of him taken about that time when he wrote these articles of his recollections of Trenton during the war. Now, he was just, of course, a young lad during that time, wasn't old enough to be a part to go off to war. But he was there, and he told some interesting stories. A few of them I won't tell you tonight because they were a little rough. So I'll pick some of the good ones tonight and some of the things that happened in town. He was a strong Confederate supporter. And I was telling my wife when I come here, I said, I've seen online the good pictures of the Confederate flag, and it's good to come to a place where the Confederate flag still flies. And the people pay reverence to that and those ancestors of ours that died for the cause in which they believed. And I believe in the time we live in our nation now, I believe we need some of the things that they had back then to stand up for the causes that they stood for today. Charlie Buck Harwood, again, he was born to a wealthy family in Trenton. Here's some more photographs of him, and I'll have him up here afterwards if you want to take a look at some of those. And he told some good stories about the war. So, Casey, if we can go to the first slide. We'll talk a little bit about Forrest. This is part of Forrest's trade. Many folks are familiar with when he came across the Tennessee through West Tennessee. We're looking at December the 20th. 1862. He's made his way from Spring Creek, Tennessee, which is a little bit outside of Jackson. He's going to divide his troops. Some are going to go to Humboldt, and the majority are going to go to Trenton, where this battle and the skirmish is actually going to take place. This is the road he came in. So right as you come into Trenton off Highway 45, it's now known as the Gibson Road. At the time, it was the Lexington Road, and would have made its way all the way back to Lexington, Tennessee. There's kind of a map of this tour here. We're going to go on kind of a battle tour is what it's called. There's actually a brochure you can actually take and go to Trenton and go by all these locations, and it'll tell you about each of them. Where he's going to come in here, kind of give you an idea where we're at. This is that picture we just saw over here. We're going to kind of work our way around back in town and talk about some locations and some things that happened at them. The first one we're going to stop at is going to be the Oddfellows Female Collegiate Institute. Young ladies there at the time at that female college, they had moved all their classes upstairs for fear of safety because the federal occupation had already taken place in Trenton. The troops had come in October of '62, so they had some fear of the federal soldiers. Charlie Buck will tell about in some of the stories how some of the men harassed the ladies, so they finally moved them upstairs. But as we'll see here, the Confederates will come into town with Forrest. They'll come right in front of this school, and they'll actually drop their lunch baskets out to feed these guys. So they're well fed when they get into town. And I can tell tonight we good Confederate folks like to eat well, don't they? It's some very good food tonight. We'll also hear on that location, that school that you're finding there. That school that was built a little bit before the war, about 1860, was a two-story brick building. During '63, the Federals actually used it as a hospital. They burned it shortly thereafter. That lot remained empty for several years. Then you have this home that's built in the 1890s to replace a nice Victorian home that's used for weddings and such today. It was built by Julius Freed. He was a Jewish immigrant who was also a Confederate veteran. We'll kind of move on up. How many's been to Trenton? Has anybody been to Trenton? So some folks are familiar with what Trenton looks like. If you've kind of been familiar with what the courthouse is. Very pretty building. And this is kind of where we're going to center the next few around. Our first stop, if you're there, Captain Charles Anderson and aide to Forrest, the command took bonds and oaths of allegiance. The people of the town. Charlie Buck really talks a lot about in these articles of how these men were forced at gunpoint to take these oaths of allegiances. Well, he's come in, he's brought them out here on the courthouse lawn, and he's burned them all. Also, we find out, really Colonel Fry there could have really taken care and stopped the Confederates from coming in if he really barricaded the courthouse. We find out that did not happen. In the quote here, a newspaper article tells us a little bit if they would put up cotton bales, but the Captain Half they really had to go through the homes of their friends to get to the courthouse where the Federals were stationed. There's a picture of that courthouse. It was built in 1841, torn down in 1899. That's a picture actually of a hanging that took place in the 1880s there on the lot. There's another also picture of that building. There it was torn down in 99 to build the current courthouse that's there now. We'll kind of go, this would seem to be more at the end of the thing, but it kind of goes along with where we're at in the location downtown. As Forrest is going to leave after the battle, after he's taken the depot, he's actually going to go back up the M&O Railroad and head towards Union City. Fourth stop on, it's also right there on Court Square. Company D of the 122nd Illinois is going to arrive. They're going to set up their camp inside a large structure that's set on the west side of Court Square. Of course, that building's gone now. This is a picture probably from around 1910 of some of those buildings that were there at the time of the war. We find several really interesting stories as they come in. One of these we'll find out in just a minute. They wanted to unfurl the U.S. flag. Of course, they were very happy about that, but some of the locals weren't so much happy. There's another view also of those buildings. There was a hotel there at the time as well. Anderson Davis here, and I tell everybody don't get confused, as I told Casey before we got here, I said don't let me say Jefferson Davis, because this man wasn't such a good man to most of us. He is in 61, Davis has gone to Cairo, Illinois, and he's picked him up a U.S. flag at the time, and he's going to bring it back to really a Confederate stronghold, we'll say, at Trenton. And he's going to unfurl that flag there in front of what is known at the time of the Union Hotel, later the Pierce Hotel on Court Square. He's going to pull that out and going to show it to some folks. And of course, at this time, you've got Camp Trenton, which was right north of Trenton, which would be the 47th Tennessee was being organized. So these men were still there in town when he brings this flag out. So you can imagine that wasn't such a popular thing. One of the quotes of the time says, "Such a rag couldn't float to the breeze in Trenton." So I'll say he was a brave man to pull that out. We're going to find out he's quickly told to take that down. There's the building in front of where that was done. This is the second structure that's there. If you're familiar with downtown Trenton, that building is known as the Smith Building today. It's kind of a pink-colored building. It's still on Court Square. It's from 1879 after they tore down the Pierce Hotel. The flag of Company D unfurled. This is an interesting story. In October of 62, the 122nd has made its way into downtown Trenton. They have set up camp there. One of the first things that's told in the newspaper they wanted to do was unfurl the U.S. flag from the cupola of the courthouse. Of course, those boys were very excited about to see the flag wave there from the Trenton courthouse. And Charlie Buck will tell some more stories about there was some pretty angry citizens at that time, and kind of got rough later on in that same week. Confederate Monument. If you've been to Trenton, you've probably seen that Confederate Monument that sits on Court Square. It was put together about 1907. It was set there in the middle of the street. The local UDC built that one. It was damaged back in, I guess, 2006 by a storm. It got toppled. It's a hollow structure. I can't think what you call it. It's not concrete. But it fell over and toppled over. And the soldiers were replaced. Local SCV camp there in Trenton got that replaced. And also the county court sent some money that way to have it repaired. There's a couple more photographs of it. There's 3 of those soldiers that you see on top of the color picture. There's one at the Trimble flag site, the large flag that's up in Trimble, Tennessee, that flies, Confederate flag. There's one like him there. There's one on Mr. Bill Foster, who is the brigade commander, Jeff Forrest. And then there's the one at the courthouse. There's another picture of the new courthouse that's there today. You can see that Confederate monument right there in the center of the street. Interesting story here. This happened about that time, and I want to read you some quotes from it. T. Lee Wales. There you'll see a photograph of him and Ginger Cakes and Beers. It's the title of the little story here. And let me find it. I'm going to read you his quote. Basically, after Forrest has come in, he set up his artillery. They fired upon the depot. Well, there's going to be different ammunitions. There's going to be guns. There's going to be several different divisions there. Well, they're going to go in here. Forrest is going to allow them to take them, do what they want, burn what's left. People don't take. Well, Mr. Wells goes in and he gets him a couple of guns, a couple of shotguns out of there. Now, the story will say he's not much of a hunter. He didn't have much use for the guns. So he actually came back up to Court Square and met a gentleman there to sell those to him. But he didn't want to buy them, so he had some ginger cakes made and some good homemade beer there. So he made a trade. They went back into the Oppenheimer store. Oppenheimer was a photographer, and they made the trade there. But the deal was he couldn't take it because he wasn't supposed to be selling the beer and all that, so he had to drink it in the back of the store. Well, we found out it was a good bit that he drank and a whole bunch of those cakes. Several pounds of cakes, it'll say, the story said. But he later on in life said he never liked any of those things again. And you'll find that you probably think he would be the town drunk. Really, he wasn't. He was actually a pretty upstanding citizen. The Davis carriage shop, we learned about Anderson Davis, who had the flag. There's a picture of his carriage shop. This is a little bit after the war, probably about 1866 or 67. That photograph is made when there was a fair coming to town. But he brought that back to that location, stored that flag. Now, in the newspaper article, it tells us that flag was still in existence in 1904, but still haven't found what happened. It was a fairly large flag as well, and the carriage shop is where he brought it to. More of the kind of the carriage shop, again, if you're familiar with downtown Trenton, these are just a block off of Court Square. This house for a long time was a funeral home. It's the residence of Robert Seat. He was an early settler of Trenton, came there shortly after the county was established in 1823. He was an attorney. He had several children. One of the children that we're going to find out in just a minute became mayor. He served some 11 or 12 terms, some of about 40 years, and even served into his 90s as mayor. And here's him. This is his son, William Early Seat. He was a little too young to go off to war, but there's an interesting little story here as he met Forrest during this time in town. Let me read this to you here. It says, in 1862, the building to your left was the residence of Robert Seat, early merchant of the town. 11-year-old son, William Seat, ran up to General Forrest, and as he was sitting on his horse near the courthouse, he asked the Confederate commander that he be allowed to join his army. The general replied, "You little scamp, go back home to your mother." The young Seat grew up to serve several terms as mayor and was a strong Confederate supporter even years after the war and involved in many of the reunions and helping them be organized in the Gibson County area. But he was a little young, and General Forrest told him to go back home. Now, a couple of his brothers, one actually served with Forrest that was a little bit older, and one went up into Kentucky. Another story here, we'll find out lots of stories that come from Charlie Buck that he tells about happened around town. This one is really interesting to see how the people of the town felt at the time of the war. This is from some of the Illinois troops that were here, and they tell in this newspaper article that basically if a U.S. flag was hung up, the people of the town would actually go out in the dirt streets and go into the roughest conditions to avoid walking under it and being anywhere near it. And there's several stories from that newspaper that talk about how the people of the town were really treated by the Illinois. Horace Lovins, he was also another one that shared some stories of what he witnessed on December the 20th of 1862 as Forrest came into town. This house is still standing. The color picture, you can see it as it is today. It's a funeral home today. There's a couple of older photographs. Horace Lovins actually stood on that porch as a young child and watched General Forrest come in on College Street and other troops come in on High Street. And he'll tell in the story that he heard them do the rebel yell as they come down the street. So, again, strong Confederate supporters in the town at the time. Andrew College, again, another one of these here was used as a hospital by the Federals. General Forrest is actually going to travel in front of it. Kind of a similar story, how some of the students that were there at the time and people of the town actually brought food to them there. Later, it was used by the Federals for a hospital, but it wasn't burned on the next picture. And then the later building was Peabody High School for a long time. There's a picture of that building. At the time, it was built a little bit before 1860. It's pretty much shut down by 1862 after that point from the school. It opened up for a short period of time after the war. By 1870, roughly, It was closed again, used by the school system for a high school for many years before it was torn down in 1917. Now, to get an idea of where that is, if you're familiar, some folks may know what the old Peabody High School is. It's a very large building. It's used as an apartment complex now. It's been totally restored. It's almost pretty good. You're getting close to a mile, a good quarter of a mile from the courthouse where that sits. Here we find out that Forest Artillery was set up in the cemetery. You can actually go to that location today and you can stand on that same ground where that was. There is a monument that is there that is set up. That bottom picture you'll see is actually from a newspaper about that time when Forrest was in Trenton, a sketch of that. And that would be that hill, which is known as Texas Hill. Not a whole lot of sure why it's called Texas Hill. There may have been some troops here at the time that were from Texas. But that's the name that it picked up that time. There's a couple of soldiers buried there and about 4 unknowns that are buried at that location. Here's kind of a map. I know it's kind of small for you if you're in the back, but you can kind of see a distance of where things are. With the very top, the red brick buildings, the courthouse, the depot over there, the cemetery down there. Now they say the distance that these cannons were fired. Some folks in Trenton will question if that's the exact location really where that was, because that is a good distance for him to hit with that artillery fire. That's a good distance away. There's also on the lower left, there's a picture of what's there today. There was a monument put down. I believe it's about a little bit after 1900. A local lady in town who was involved with the United Dogs of Confederacy, but it wasn't put down by them. She personally brought money in to put down to memory of those unknowns that are buried there. This is a house a lot of folks may be familiar with if you've been to Jackson. Now remember this in the news. It's known as Scrapes Folly, now known as the Providence House. It was moved from Trenton in 2010, and you can go on to that next picture and see a couple of newer pictures of it. But at the time of the war, it sat on High Street. It was the tallest building in Trenton. And it was actually used to several local citizens climbed up on the roof of it and was able to view what the activity that was happening in the depot, which is only a couple of short city blocks away. And that house was used for that. It was built in 1837 by James Scrape. He lost it sometime around about the war. And then it passed into several other hands. Judge Matthew Marshall Neal, who became a Tennessee State Supreme Court Justice. He became Chief Justice as well. He also lived in that house for many years. He went to Washington College when General Lee was president. It actually became a good friend of him, and there's some correspondence that's still in existence from when him and Lee corresponded. Again, there's a picture of Judge Neal there on the left. His wife is Eliza Green, and she's the daughter of General Thomas Green. Some will be familiar with that name. Part of the Red River campaign. He was killed there. The Raines residence is just very close to that same location, what we know as the Neal House, or Scrapes Folly, just a couple of houses down. The story will go there. The granddaughter and the grandparents actually viewed what was actually, again, happening at the depot at the time through a small window that you can still go in that house today and see that same location. It really hasn't changed any, and you can still see the depot because there's a lot of houses been gone. And they viewed it. They also tell stories about standing on the porch when the Confederates come into town. Now, again, these are some of the few people that actually stayed in Trenton. I said a minute ago that there was roughly 1,500 to 2,000 in Trenton in the immediate area. By 1862, there was less than 500. Some of the wealthier people actually stayed in town. This is another location, just a couple of houses down again from that. You're about a block and a half away from the depot where Forrest fired upon. Sam Wells was a soldier that was actually killed at that location. He was firing some sharpshooters that were set up on a two-story brick building near the depot. We saw this map a minute ago where the depot was, and just again a couple of blocks away. He was killed at that location. There's also in this same area tobacco stem were set up there. There was another couple of soldiers under Forrest that were actually killed there. And again, that's that same location. Kind of get an idea by the colors. Again, the top yellow is the courthouse. The larger yellow towards the bottom is the cemetery. And then on the left there, you'll see the depot location. The Considine and Grocery Sharpshooters. It was a two-story building that stood right near the tracks and right near the depot. And the Federals, by the time Forrest had come in, they've set about, I believe it was 10 sharpshooters up on top of this building. Really never seen the building. According to county historians, it was a fairly large building, 2 stories. and they were able to get a good vantage point. Again, there's another view of that current depot there. It was built about 1912. Now, at the very end of it, and I don't believe I have a picture of it on there, you can still see a wooden part of that structure. Part of the original depot that was there during the war is still there. Most of it was burned, but there was a small part that remained, and it's on the far end of that. Here's from Harper's Weekly of that same time, 1862, a couple of images. That tall building you see there on the left is a mill, and Forrest is actually going to fire an artillery. The first cannonball is going to go through that building, and we'll see a picture of it in here. It's still in existence. It was found in 1904, dug up in the field. And it's actually, it's really, really large. Again, I'm not too good at the measurements and diameters of them, but it's a good size ball. And you find it went through that building, and in 1904, some local farmers dug it up. And then there's kind of, as we close here, you'll find out that there's the historic marker that's on that site, which is on Highway 104 is where that's located off, just right down from the depot. And we'll find, after Forrest captures several there, he'll move his way on to Union City. And so that's basically what kind of happened on that day. The battle was pretty simple. It was about 4 hours. The whole time period, really, all this is happening. Again, a strong supporter of the Confederates, still in Trenton. Charlie Buck really tells some great stories about, you really learn what things were like in the town, how the people felt towards one another. Really a rough situation. And something I was really surprised of, that so many of the wealthy folks actually stayed in town. Usually you hear of many of them leaving, going outside to other farms, but they actually stayed in town. There's another story that happened a little bit before that time, back in October, when the 122nd Illinois came in. A man by the name of Little John Wilkins, his family was fairly wealthy. Several of them were attorneys. He was actually knew about the 122nd coming in, so he was going to move many of his horses out to a country farm. Well, he's been spotted what he's doing going out, so they actually chase him down right outside of town, shoot him, and kill him. And just recently, a photograph has come in to be known. Didn't know one of it existed only 2 days before he was shot and killed. It was dated, so some rough times in Gibson County and Trenton. So that's a little bit about the Battle of Trenton. Hope you enjoyed it. We have a lot of this stuff posted, or some of it will be, on our Facebook page and website, so if you want to go read some more, there's a lot of articles and interesting stories. A couple of other things real fast. 47th Tennessee, folks are probably familiar with those in Shiloh, but they came down as reinforcement the second day. Led by Colonel Munson R. Hill, who was an attorney. He was killed shortly after the war. Y'all can take a look at this photograph here at the end of him. He's wearing a Knights Templar uniform. And that photograph has recently also just come to light. It's kind of weird how it came about. It actually came through a family that was strong Union supporters. But they had a photograph of him. And he led the 47th Tennessee. He was colonel of it. He was, of course, at Shiloh. He was sick with a fever at Shiloh, so he was pretty much taken out of command not long after. Didn't serve long in the war, but he died in 1867 in Memphis of yellow fever. So that's kind of a little bit about it. And briefly, what our camp does, the John B Ingram camp in Jackson. We're named after Colonel John Ingram. He was captain of the Denmark Danes, who was a group of 6 Tennessee, Company K, that left, that joined the Jackson, went to Union City, of course. We're at Shiloh as well. He died as well in 1876 of Memphis, carrying for folks with yellow fever. He actually went a little insane during that time, went to the National Insane Asylum, died there. So that's kind of how the camp is named. It originates from the original United Confederate Veterans Camp in 1888. It was organized, and the time they disbanded by the mid-20s. A few years later, the SCV picked it up really early and continued that name. So that's a little bit about the John Ingram Camp. We meet there at the Casey Jones Village in Jackson, so anytime you guys are up that way, feel free to come see us. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
When do you guys meet?
We meet usually the 3rd or 4th Sunday at 2 o'clock. We don't Sunday afternoon. We don't eat or anything, but you can actually come a little bit early because it's there.